Hello and welcome to episode four. Yes, episode four of AR Chat, where we talk about all the big trends, highlight the people, and really focusing on what's going on in the analyst relations community. I'm your moderator today, and I'm Stephen Dickens. I'm joined by my fellow co-hosts, Nathan Herman and Crystal Golightly. Hey guys, welcome to the show. So before we go any further, we're joined today by Carter Lusher. I love watching Carter's posts on LinkedIn and engaging. You'll see me always in the comments. They always lead to a really interesting, insightful discussion. So, Carter, welcome to the show. Tell us a little bit about you and what you do.
Well, first off, I just want to give all of you guys kudos for the AR Chat podcast. I think these are really fun, really interesting, and really insightful. So I am honored to be invited to be the third guest, though you've had 4 episodes. So again, kudos.
Saying all the right things already, Carter. We like
I
you.
love
So
it.
you're off to a great start.
Yes. Well, let me give you the elevator pitch about myself and what I'm currently up to. So I've been in the analyst game for over a third of a century, starting out as an IT manager who was a client with Gartner, one of the early clients. And then I said, hey, that looks like a fun job. So I jumped to the other side of the table and became a Gartner analyst, ending up as one of the original Gartner research fellows. Then I frankly got frustrated because the vendors weren't giving me the information I needed, how I needed it, when I needed it. Ding, ding, ding. Oh, business opportunity. So I eventually ended up leaving Gartner and co-founding the original Sage Circle with venture capital backing, which was, of course, Architect, the software, as well as AR best practices research. And then I said, I have not exactly gotten, real world experience with analyst relations, even though I've been advising AR managers about this. So I jumped over to the AR side of the table. I became the director of analyst relations at HP during a very trying time for HP. So that was really a trial by fire. Then I jumped back over to the advisor of analyst relations, back to the analyst side with Ovum, where I was another research fellow working on methodologies and enterprise application research, and then back to AR. And now I'm back on the advisory side. So Lusher Advisory is a boutique research and advisory firm focused on the analyst ecosystem and the complexity of the analyst ecosystem. We work with 5 audiences. First and foremost, of course, AR professionals. Number 2 is technology vendor executives. 3 are business leaders. 4 are analysts and analyst firms. And then 5 agencies, marketing and PR. Now, what we do is that we provide the strategic framework and practical best practices advice to help organizations sharpen their strategy, build influential relationships, and get the most value from their analyst engagements.
Yeah, that makes sense.
So, Carter, there's a lot to unpack there, and we will. But one of the first sort of jumping off point questions we have, and I think given your sort of third of a century kind of involvement in analyst relations, I'll go to Crystal because she's kind of on a mission to understand this entire space. So, Crystal, what's our first sort of question we're asking everybody here?
Yeah, I always like to go back to history and I just love to know the origin stories. So, Carter, you tell me, since you are part of my professional origin story, tell me if you can share with us, how did all this start? Not the Sage Circle AR Insights connection, which that could also be an interesting topic for another time. But how did this AR world start? And who do you think is the first AR person?
That's a great question.
Right?
Oh, yeah. That's a great question because when I first joined Gartner in October of 1992, these many years ago, after being a client of Gartner, there was no analyst relations that I could find. I would send out standard faxes to introduce myself. Yes, fax machines, remember those? to vendors saying, hey, I'm an analyst at Gartner. I'd like to get a briefing on this product or your strategy or whatever. And they would say, oh, an analyst. And they would throw me over to investor relations. No clue about, Gartner and Forrester and Yankee Group and like that. But we think about it in the early 1990s, when I joined Gartner, there were less than 70 analysts.
Wow.
Forrester was
And
maybe
what do we
half
think
that.
they're up to now, Carter? Just to give us a bookend, what would you predict they're up to now?
Oh, they, in their investor relations materials, say that they're over 2,500.
Yeah.
So we've gone from
Analysts.
70 to 2,500 in 30 years, something
Well,
like
they
that.
went,
That's
Gartner went
mind
from,
blowing.
Yeah, it's
yeah,
crazy, man.
well, the thing to remember about Gartner in the 90s, and the reason why Gartner is the behemoth today, is that when Gideon Gartner stepped down from being the CEO of Gartner, Manny Fernandez took over. And he went on this super aggressive acquisition strategy, as well as organic growth. So during the 90s, Manny made 65 acquisitions at Gartner, as well as hiring a bunch of other analysts. Every time that a technology vendor had layoffs like DEC or IBM or whoever, we used to joke that we would go set up a card table outside of their headquarters to get the people coming out to join Gartner. So by 1995, toward the end of 1995, Gartner had over 500 analysts.
So
So we
Wow.
went
Carter,
from less than 70 to nearly 500 in
That
only
is
a few years.
well, you just hit on a thread there, and it's coming out in a lot of the discussions, and it was in your introduction, so I'll kind of take you back to it. That kind of almost revolving door between analyst relations professional, analyst relations firm, vendor, and kind of I was literally chatting to somebody last night who's going to be leaving a firm, who's an ex-Gartner analyst, who's going to be looking to become an analyst again, and it's kind of there's a revolving door. I think you've got a really interesting perspective given your history, but obviously what you do in your day to day. Do you want to talk about that a little bit? Because I think it's a fascinating. I've been at this game now for 4 years, work as an analyst. I knew analysts when I was a product manager at IBM, but it wasn't abundantly clear to me that you could go from product manager to analyst. I'd love to get your perspective on that rolling, sort of rotating door, if you will.
And I'd like to
Oh,
tack one thing onto that because I
sure.
think it goes together really nicely. As you're answering that, what has been kind of a common thread between the different worlds?
Mm-hmm.
So clearly there is some kind of overlap, skill overlap, personality overlap. So yeah, what hasn't changed in kind of each of your roles as an analyst relations pro, and as an analyst relations advisor?
Okay. All great questions. First and foremost, let me sort of finish the origin story real quickly, finishing up crystals, because that will then transition into the other two points that Stephen and Nathan just brought up. So again, early 90s, nobody understood the analysts. Nobody had analyst relations backgrounds. So we would get, tossed over to investor relations, and they would quickly say, you're not relevant to us, get lost. PR sort of picked up the strategy. And then over the next few years, as Gartner started to really take off and start to develop influence, then vendors started saying, hey, we need to have somebody focused on these analysts, whoever they are, because they seem different from PR. They're definitely not Wall Street analysts, even though Gideon Gartner himself was named the top Wall Street analyst for IBM several years in a row. The reality was what we did was much different.
Mm-hmm.
So that's when you started seeing people informally becoming analyst relations functions within the organization, initially part-time and then overtime, full-time. As to, who was one of the early analyst relations professionals, I frankly don't have a memory of that. It was just sort of an organic development that went along.
But it sounds like the function itself is born somewhere in the late 90s, early 2000s.
Yeah, Yeah.
I mean, Carter, given the firms that were around then that were at a scale, it's going to be a Cisco, it's going to be an IBM, it's going to be a, one of the, a HP, as was back then before the HPE split. It's a Dell maybe. It's going to be one of those kind of what I describe as the OEMs now, on those big old school. And I mean old school, not from the technology that they make, but from
Yeah.
they're from the maybe late 60s. And would you agree? Do you think it's going to be one of those firms if we look for who was the first AR professional that did this full time?
Distinctly possible.
Mhm.
However, what we also see is that a lot of the software startups, remember that during this time, Silicon Valley was transitioning from being silicon centric, doing more and more software.
Mm-hmm.
And so you started seeing, startups like Vantiv, Clarify, Scopus, Siebel, in the area that I covered, really started becoming quite sophisticated, reaching out to the analysts. So
Mhm.
it could have been one of the, like I said, the OGs, the
Somebody
original
like an
boosters.
Oracle, maybe, or somebody like
Um,
that,
yeah,
potentially.
Oracle, was
I think
definitely one.
I'd
And in
love
fact,
to I'd
go
love
ahead.
to jump in with a question right there because I think you're hitting on something we've touched on. And I know Crystal's passionate about this. You said a lot of startups were seeing the opportunities that existed with analysts in the late 90s, early 2000s. Analyst relations is interesting. It's generally not a function that exists at a company until it reaches a certain size
Hmm.
because it's seen as a nice to have, not a need to have. But if I'm kind of jumping to connect the dots, maybe at that time a startup views analyst interaction as a must have, not a nice to have, and that gave them a leg up. I mean, what are your thoughts on that? I see
Oh,
Steven got some thoughts too, so I'd
can I
love
just
to
say
hear.
something really quick? I've never heard the word startup and Siebel in the same conversation. I mean, that definitely has to do with my age, right? And so, anyways, it's just kind of funny to hear that framing because we are talking about the origins of high tech, right? And so it feels kind of funny to
Yeah,
hear.
some of the folks that I worked with early on, were tiny little companies. And what was happening back then, and you're absolutely right, Nathan, that a lot of startups these days, look at, you know, the analyst and analyst relations because they don't understand the function. They don't, necessarily understand the influence and the impact and how they can get value for it. But back in the mid-90s, as Gartner started to take off and we created the Magic Quadrant, and when I first joined Gartner, there wasn't, Magic Quadrant was just sort of an idea that one or two analysts were playing with. But once the Magic Quadrant took off as a influencing tool, then all of a sudden it went from the analysts having to reach out and say, "Hey, give me some information," to where we were getting knocks on the doors. "Hey, we'd like to talk to you. Can we talk to you?" What was really interesting back then is that the chief executives of some of these fast-growing startups realized that the analysts like a Gartner or a Forrester or an IDC not only were influencing the buyers, but we were influencing the market, the category definitions. We were influencing the investor community, both the VCs and then Wall Street, where they eventually wanted to do IPOs. And remember back then, IPOs happened much earlier in a company's life cycle than they do today. So companies were going public at like $100 million. And so they were looking at us and saying, "Hey, the industry analysts are a great way to influence the Wall Street analysts as well." And oh, by the way, we get this new idea about, combining, marketing and maybe customer service and maybe sales applications all into one. So we were really looked at as a way to, for these startups to define the market, raise its visibility, influence the buyers, mainly by, just saying their name occasionally. I remember once I got a call from a CEO of a startup, and the client service person at the QuickPath at Gartner. QuickPath was what we call the client service organization. Called me up and said, "Hey, Carter, this vendor CEO wants to talk to you, and she she doesn't want to brief you. She just wants to chat with you for a few minutes." I went, fine by me. So connected up, did the call, and this CEO of this startup, which was a successful, fast-growing startup, could not stop thanking me, and I'm going like, why? Well, it turns out that I had mentioned the company's name several times during my speeches, just as an illustration for a vendor that does whatever it was, email management systems. And so every time that I just mentioned her company's name, whether at a Gartner event or at an industry event or something like that, their phones would ring off the hook.
Yeah, that makes
And
sense.
so it wasn't that I was trying to promote, I was just, frankly, being able to say, I know these companies that you don't know, just made me look cool.
It's a perfect example too, because one of the things that is sometimes seen as not a beginner metric, but one of the first metrics you can track is how many times are you mentioned in analyst research, a showcase. Now, whether or not that's a good metric to track, that's an entirely different episode. I think there are better, right? But let's draw a line to the modern day then. So you're saying in the late 90s, early 2000s, companies are exiting, they're going IPO, $100 million in revenue. That's not the case in 2025.
Nope.
So is that why analyst relations is seen as, I don't want to call it a legacy function, but kind of a more mature function within the life cycle of a business? Or is this where the diversity of the analyst landscape comes into play in 2025, where maybe a startup's not getting the same recognition they once got at a Gartner, but maybe there are other analysts in the ecosystem where you could get your kind of same value that you would have gotten in the late 90s, early 2000s? Feel free to take that question wherever. I know, Stephen, I think you've got some thoughts, so I'd love to hear those. Carter, you as well. Crystal.
Okay,
Ethan,
well,
I
I'll
think
jump first and I'll turn it over to Stephen. So one of the important things for all vendors, regardless of their size, regardless of their stage of development, is that there is this massive diversity of analyst firms out there. According to AR Insights and its Architect database, there are over 7,000 influencers over 1,500 firms. And so some of the firms are very focused on a particular slice of the market. So MGI Research, focused only on the monetization applications, billing, CPQ, revenue recognition, etc. Where others like the behemoth Gartner, they've got 40 analysts just covering supply chain alone. So what's important for vendors of all size is to take a strategic approach to their analyst list and realize they might not get traction with the behemoth, but hey, there's this interesting boutique that's always popping up in either the blogs or the press or LinkedIn. They're
Absolutely.
doing speeches or whatever, and they're very focused on a marketplace, but that's your marketplace. So it's really incredibly important, not for vendors of all sizes, all stages, not to obsess over Gartner. Don't ignore Gartner, but don't obsess over Gartner. And
That's
then
great
work
advice.
with other analyst firms like Stephen or either a boutique or a solo practitioner. They can all have a lot to offer.
So, Stephen, I
Turn over to
yeah,
you.
I want to get your thoughts on this, because we were chatting on
yeah,
LinkedIn this past weekend about the idea of eminence. So where does this come into
yeah.
play?
And I'm really fascinated to have this conversation in front of Carter because it would probably be the perfect person to get feedback. There's almost an equation in my mind that starts to sort of crystallize. And it depends what you want from an analyst firm, and we can talk about that after the equation. So you've got domain expertise. This is somebody who can go super deep on your topic. They can go head to head with a product manager, and they know the feature functions of what your product does versus the feature functions of the competition. They're deep in the weeds of the product. That's kind of one bucket, and I call that domain expertise. The second bucket is reach, and I'm using reach, not influence, and I'll explain what I mean. That is, have they got access to the TV networks? Have they got access to reporters? Do you see them mentioned in quotes? Have they got a big following on the social platforms? So it's the broadest definition of reach. And the equation I think we're all looking for is domain expertise plus reach equals eminence. And I say eminence, not influence, because the word influence kind of then takes us into influencer, and that can mean different things. Some analysts get tweaked by that phrase because what it means in a B2C context, and being compared to Kim Kardashian selling makeup is not a great conversation for some analysts. I'm completely relaxed about it. I'd love to have Kim Kardashian's influence and be able to charge $50,000 for a LinkedIn post. But we digress. But I think that's a modern equation. And I think, as Carter mentions, you look across the entire analyst landscape, you've got to think about analyst relations firms delivering different things for you. So if you look at Gartner, they've got the end user customer feedback loop largely locked up. You look at IDC, they've got the market sizing and TAM and market share data market locked up. You look at Forrester, they've got, a combination of both of those things. Then as you kind of look, and I know Carter does across those various firms, you probably get down to somebody like my firm with 4 or 5 hours, and you go, what is Stephen's firm good for Hyperframe in the overall kind of mix? And I think what I'm seeing is previously where 100% of the money was spent with the gift firms, what I'm seeing is a transition where maybe 70% of your money is spent with the gift firms and 30% should be spent with independents. Now, whether that's all with me, that's up for discussion, obviously, but I would argue you're probably better off getting a combination of 3 or 4 analyst firms that are boutiques and independents, because we all do things slightly differently. Some of us have got more reach on social, some of us have got more reach into CIO and CTO networks, some of us have got different styles about how we talk to our constituents. So I think the overall landscape is changing. We're seeing influencer relations start to get pulled into analyst relations. The whole concept of AR for PR is sort of coming through. So I think this is what fascinates me, and the thesis for why I set the firm up in November. I think the market is changing. And I think
And
that's a rising tide that raises all boats for everybody. I don't see it as competition. I see it as we've got what is it, $15 billion TAM for this market. Probably, Carter, you know that better than me. There's enough space for everybody to exist in that landscape.
so, Stephen, I will say you kind of triggered something in my mind, which is I feel like we've kind of been talking about this in abstract ways, is our industry kind of has a branding issue, right? Because
Mhm.
I feel like what we're describing is the analyst relationship not really being a relationship where it's one way, but truly being a partnership, right? And that actually activates different market things, like you're saying, imminence, market activators. I obviously I can't come up with a catchy way to package that up. Um, and so it just really kind of interesting because I know there's a couple of threads on LinkedIn and different places where people talk about even the naming convention of analyst connotating a junior role, right? And then even analyst relations then creates another sort of questionable, like, is this actually a valuable strategic type of role. And so that sort of got me thinking about that.
First off, I want to comment on what Stephen was just saying. I like the idea of imminence. That's a great way to sort of think about this. But the one thing I will expand upon is the idea that things are changing in the influencer, analyst, thought leader environment. It's always been changing since I was first around. Like I said, Manny Fernandez made 65 acquisitions in the 90s. Why did he make 65 acquisitions? Because Gartner analysts were going and leaving and starting up their own firms, and we would just acquire them back because we wanted their clients, not so much the analysts. We did lose a lot of analysts for those acquisitions, but it was a roll up. And then since the internet started, becoming a source of information in the late 90s, we have consistently heard about the death of the analysts, or the analysts are doomed. And I'm working on a research note on that right now. You've seen some of this research in the past, like in the webinar I did with AR Insights back in 2023 on the 5-year scenario. But I've used this chart that I'm working on, or expanding it. It's like every couple of years, there's a new, killer for the analysts out there, whether it's the internet, free information, the early blogosphere, the early social networks, the peer review sites. Now it's AR, agentic AI, AI, generative AI, you name it. It's going to kill the analysts. But the reality is that the analysts have survived and thrived over the last, century, not century, but 40, 50 years, because they offer something interesting and valuable. And so when you start thinking about who do you want to be talking with, where do you want to invest your money, and I would say, frankly, it should be more than 30% away from the Gartners and such. Again, get imaginative. I talked about the fog of influence, information, and intelligence. And there are so many different types of folks that are available for information, intelligence, and insights that you got to sort of pick and choose off of the menu. I always say that Gartner is not a tier 1 analyst firm, which immediately stops the conversation because people are like, what? Gartner, of course, they're the tier 1. No. In my mind, you rank analysts based on relevance, tier on resources.
Yeah.
So that if in your particular market, Gartner doesn't have relevant analysts, they're not relevant.
Correct.
And so
You heard it here, folks. First, Carter Lusher with the mic drop, right? Is think about your partnerships and where you are and your maturity and all of these things, right? All of those factors play a really important role. So I do know that some of us may have a hard stop. So Carter, as I told you to toss all these things in a bag, I really wanted you to talk about some of your predictions with earnings and stuff, but maybe we'll have to have you on again as the year progresses. But tell us, what do you think about the landscape, or your overall predictions for the future?
Yeah. And maybe if I can add 2 specific questions that maybe you can answer, Carter. One is, what are your predictions for Q1 earnings? And then just high level prediction. You don't have to give it to us all. We look forward to your LinkedIn post. And then 2, what's your prediction for analyst relations? That could be 5 years from now, 10 years from now, a year from now. Give us one, and then let us know where we can find your excellent insights.
Okay, well, first and foremost, let's talk about analyst relations and analyst relations in the age of artificial intelligence. And in my research note about the essential human element, why analyst relations will thrive in the age of AI, because analyst relations is not about logistics. It's not about scheduling calls. It's about not necessarily just about developing relationships, so that's an important part of it. Internal relationships as well as external relationships. But the savvy AR professional going forward will realize that a lot of the grunt work can be done by AI. I mean, I use multiple AIs every day, about 4 or 5 or 6 hours, depending on what I'm working on. And so think about it from the point of view, get rid of the grunt work and start evolving more to a strategic advisor within the organization. Taking in all the information that you're gathering, either on inquiries, briefings, your own research, seeing what's being published, seeing what's up on LinkedIn and such like that. And transitioning from being simply a meeting organizer or a PowerPoint jockey and becoming more and more strategic in how you're being perceived within the organization and working your way up to becoming an advisor to the C-suite. So that would be my first and major prediction, because anybody who is simply a meeting organizer, they're doomed. You know, that is not a value-added activity. And as agentic AI becomes more and more prevalent, a lot of the grunt work can be done by AI.
Absolutely.
Which shouldn't be a threat. It should be a, you know,
Absolutely.
a joyous, thank goodness I can now focus on more interesting things.
The AI should not replace humans. It should allow humans to spend more time on the things that have the most value.
Exactly,
So
exactly.
then that's fantastic. And then
Yeah.
give us a prediction for earnings. Give us your top level prediction, and then we'll wrap it up here so we can let everyone get on to their 11, 12, 10 o'clock meetings.
Well, first and foremost, same as it ever was. So Gartner, when it reports its Q1 earnings in just a month or two, what we're going to see is that they're going to be growing at their contract value. I don't particularly, you know, analyze revenues or earnings per share or anything that's like that. My focus is on, you know, what's their contract value, because the contract value is a key indicator of influence. The more end users that you have as a client, the more inquiries you're getting, and thus the more, you know, ability to, you know, influence those buyers. So I perceive that, or I'm going to predict that Gartner is going to report about 12 to 13% contract value increase. Most of that's going to be around the end user section, the vendor section of their business, which is only about 25% of their advisory contracts, which, by the way, is about $5 billion with a B. And so the end user side is about 75% of that. And the vendor side is still recovering from all the layoffs and cuts and such like that in marketing. So about, you know, 12, 13, 14% increase in contract value. They will increase their sales force, which is already massive, by about the same amount. They said that, and I believe Gene Hall, that they're going to try and hire another 15% sales reps. Now, the thing to remember about sales reps within the context of a, you know, analyst firm is it takes time to get them up to speed, a year, 2 years, 3 years. So anybody that they hire today won't really be generating new end user clients for.
Yeah.
So it's very important for Gartner and Forrester and IDC to be on this hiring. Unfortunately for Forrester, they're not hiring.
No.
So Forrester, my prediction for them is they continue to slide down. You will see contract value shrink again for the 9th consecutive quarter. You will see their sales force not grow, probably shrink by a few headcount. And they only have like 570 sales reps as it is. But Gartner has over 3,500. So Forrester will continue to slide. IDC, which is not a public firm yet, but, you know, there's been rumors that Blackstone wants to be able to, you know, have them IPO, actually have IDG IPO. And so, but IDC needs to grow more of their end user clients. And they've come out with some research deliverables lately on like interactive marketscapes and such like that, that is meant to appeal to the end user. So we're going to start seeing more interesting things happening with, in terms of earnings, both with Gartner, same as it ever was. Forrester, unfortunately, same as it ever was, unfortunately downward. But other firms that are looking at, hey, here's an opportunity to go public,
Yeah.
get additional investment. And so we're gonna see more of that sort of activity in the
You're-
first quarter and then throughout the rest of the year.
You're spot on. And I think this doesn't even begin to touch on the new Informa Tech target, S&P Global with S&P Global Market Intelligence, 451 Research, as we all know and love. So
Now,
I think what we've hit on in this conversation is it is a time of uncertainty, but like you said, it's been a time of uncertainty. This industry has been on the verge of changing dramatically since its inception. Now, undoubtedly, something will change. Is that Gartner will continue to grow? Probably. Is that additional analyst firms will continue to grow in prominence or eminence, as Stephen likes to say?
yeah,
Probably. So I think the advice here is analyst relations again needs to be strategic. More important than that, it needs to be specific and programmatic. It has to be aligned to what you want to accomplish in your business. So it's not just AR for PR, although that may be one component. It's AR for strategic advisory. It's AR for product development. And I think what you said hits the nail on the head, Carter, which is analyst relations needs to work towards a future where it is the trusted advisor of the C-suite. And so I think we need to continue chatting in the future. I want to get your thoughts on the idea of Gartner as the next large consultancy, that perhaps someday it'll be treated more like McKinsey or one of the consulting houses, but we don't have that time today. So,
Hey,
Chris,
Nathan,
for you.
that is a great thing to bring to the LinkedIn world and have a conversation to
Yeah,
continue this,
absolutely.
as well as um, let's have Carter back on as we get closer to third and fourth quarters to see if we do start to see those changes a little faster, because I do feel like everything is moving in hyperspeed. And with that, I'm just going to close this out
Bring
since
us home.
Stephen has been having some Wi-Fi issues. Thank you, Carter, for joining us today in our AR chat. Nathan, always, you're a great co-host. And out there in the internet world, Stephen, I'm sure your Wi-Fi will resolve itself. I hope everyone subscribes, likes. Let's continue this great conversation about the transformation that's happening within the AR world, broader ecosystem, and outside across technology. So see you in 2 weeks. Bye, everyone.
have a great one.
Bye.